Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag, the same one her father had used 20 years ago in his auto shop back in Phoenix. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military base in Afghanistan, but she barely noticed anymore. After 8 months deployed, the heat had become just another part of her daily routine, like the sound of helicopters overhead and the taste of dust that never quite left her mouth. She knelt beside the damaged Humvee, its engine compartment open like a patient on an operating table. The vehicle had taken shrapnel from an improvised explosive device 2 days earlier, and while the armor had protected the soldiers inside, the engine had suffered significant damage. Sarah ran her fingers along the twisted metal, assessing what needed to be replaced and what could be salvaged. Growing up in her father's garage had prepared her for moments like this. While other kids were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Sarah had been learning the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had served 2 tours in Vietnam before opening his small auto repair shop. He never talked much about his time in the military, but Sarah had inherited his steady hands and his ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. The other mechanics on the base respected her skills, though it had taken time to earn that respect. When she first arrived, some of the older soldiers questioned whether a 24-year-old woman belonged in the motor pool. But Sarah had proven herself quickly, working longer hours than anyone else and successfully repairing vehicles that others had written off as total losses. She reached for her toolbox, a battered metal case that had belonged to her grandfather. Inside, each tool had its place organized with the precision her father had taught her. As she selected a wrench, she caught sight of the small tattoo on her inner wrist. Most people never noticed it, hidden as it was by her uniform sleeves and work gloves. It was simple, just a few lines of script in elegant cursive, but it meant everything to her. The tattoo read, "Para mi hija valiente," for my brave daughter in Spanish. Her father had those exact words engraved on a small silver pendant he gave her when she shipped out for basic training. The pendant now hung around her neck, tucked safely beneath her uniform, but she had decided to make the words permanent on her skin. They reminded her of who she was and where she came from, especially on the difficult days when the weight of being so far from home felt overwhelming. Sarah began removing the damaged parts from the engine, each bolt and component cataloged, mentally as she worked. The Humvee would need a new oil pan, several hoses, and possibly a rebuilt transmission. It was the kind of complex repair that would challenge even experienced mechanics, but Sarah felt confident she could get the vehicle back on the road within a few days. As she worked, she thought about the soldiers who depended on these vehicles. She had met the crew of this particular Humvee when they brought it in. Sergeant Johnson, barely older than herself, had thanked her personally and mentioned that this was the vehicle that had brought his team safely through 3 previous missions. Staff Sergeant Williams, a father of 2 young children, had joked that Sarah was the guardian angel of the motor pool. These weren't just machines to her, they were the lifelines that brought people home. The afternoon passed quickly as Sarah lost herself in the familiar rhythm of mechanical work. She had always found peace in the logical progression of diagnosis, disassembly, repair, and reconstruction. There was something deeply satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again, about understanding how hundreds of individual components work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Other soldiers passed by the motor pool throughout the day, some stopping to check on their own vehicles, others simply curious about the progress on various repairs. Sarah had become something of a legend on the base, known for her ability to resurrect vehicles that seemed beyond hope. Word had spread that if Specialist Martinez couldn't fix it, it probably couldn't be fixed. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah finally allowed herself a short break. She sat on an overturned crate, drinking water from her canteen and watching the daily ritual of soldiers preparing for evening duties. The base never truly slept, but it did settle into a different rhythm after dark. Her phone buzzed with a message from home. It was her younger brother, Carlos, sharing pictures from his college graduation ceremony the week before. Sarah felt a familiar pang of homesickness as she looked at the photos of her family celebrating without her. Her mother had sent a separate message earlier, full of pride about Sarah's service but also worry that only a mother could express. Sarah had joined the army for many reasons, but primarily because she wanted to serve something bigger than herself. Her father had instilled in her a deep sense of duty and patriotism, but more than that, she wanted to use her skills to make a real difference. In Phoenix, she had been just another mechanic in a city full of auto shops. Here, her expertise could mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. She returned to the Humvee as the evening shift began, working under the bright lights that illuminated the motor pool. The base had a different energy at night, more focused and intense. Radio chatter echoed from the communications center, and the occasional rumble of aircraft reminded everyone that they were in an active war zone. Sarah carefully installed a new oil pan, checking and double-checking her work. Precision was everything in this environment. A loose bolt or improperly seated gasket could cause a breakdown in the field, potentially putting lives at risk. She took pride in the fact that none of the vehicles she had repaired had experienced mechanical failures during missions. As she worked, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since enlisting. She had grown stronger, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. The challenges of military life had pushed her to develop skills and confidence she never knew she possessed. She had learned to be comfortable with uncertainty, to make critical decisions under pressure, and to trust in her abilities even when others doubted them. The tattoo on her wrist caught the light as she reached for another tool. Para mi hija valiente. Her father had been right to call her brave, though she hadn't felt particularly courageous when she first arrived at the base. Courage, she had learned, wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Every day in this place required a different kind of bravery, whether it was the courage to crawl under a potentially unstable vehicle or the emotional strength to maintain hope and purpose in a challenging environment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new vehicles to repair, and new opportunities to serve her fellow soldiers. Sarah tightened the last bolt on the oil pan and began gathering her tools. The Humvee would be ready for testing in the morning, another successful repair that would help keep her unit safe and operational. As she secured her toolbox and prepared to head back to her quarters, she had no idea that the next day would change everything. The morning air carried the familiar scent of diesel fuel and metal as Sarah arrived at the motor pool before dawn. She preferred to start early, before the heat became unbearable, and while the base was still relatively quiet. The Humvee from yesterday sat exactly where she had left it, ready for its final inspection and test drive. Sarah had barely begun checking her work when Sergeant First Class Davis approached with an unusual expression on his face. Davis was a career soldier, 22 years in the Army, and Sarah had never seen him look nervous. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, a sure sign that something important was happening. Martinez, we're getting a surprise inspection today, he said, his voice lower than usual. High-level brass coming through. General Morrison himself is making an unscheduled visit to review our operations. Sarah nodded, continuing to check the oil levels in the repaired vehicle. She had heard of General Morrison but had never seen him in person. He was a legend in military circles, a decorated combat veteran who had served in multiple conflicts and was known for his hands-on leadership style. Unlike many high-ranking officers who observed operations from a safe distance, Morrison had a reputation for getting close to the action and talking directly with enlisted personnel. Why the surprise visit? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Unscheduled inspections usually meant something significant was happening, either very good or very bad. Davis shrugged, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. Could be anything. Maybe checking our readiness levels, maybe investigating that supply chain issue from last month, or maybe he just wants to see how we're doing out here. Either way, make sure everything is spotless and by the book. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the entire motor pool prepared for the inspection. Every tool was cleaned and organized, every work area swept and arranged according to regulation standards. Sarah double-checked her paperwork, ensuring that all maintenance logs were up to date and properly filed. She had always been meticulous about documentation, but today every detail mattered even more than usual. Around noon, word came down that the general's convoy had arrived at the base. Sarah could feel the tension in the air as soldiers threw out. The facility prepared for the inspection. She focused on her work, putting the finishing touches on the Humvee repair and beginning a routine maintenance check on another vehicle. The motor pool fell silent when General Morrison entered, flanked by his aide and the base commander. Sarah had expected someone imposing and intimidating, but the general was surprisingly approachable in appearance. He was shorter than she had imagined, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the operation. He wore the standard desert camouflage uniform, with only his rank insignia distinguishing him from any other soldier. Morrison moved through the motor pool methodically, stopping to speak with each mechanic about their current projects. He asked detailed questions about repair procedures, parts availability, and vehicle readiness rates. Sarah was impressed by his technical knowledge. This wasn't just a ceremonial visit by someone unfamiliar with the actual work being done. When the general reached Sarah's work area, she stood at attention and prepared to brief him on the Humvee repair. Morrison listened intently as she explained the damage assessment, the parts that had been replaced, and the testing procedures she would use to ensure the vehicle was mission-ready. He asked several follow-up questions that demonstrated a genuine understanding of automotive engineering principles. "Show me the engine compartment," Morrison said, and Sarah immediately opened the hood to display her work. The general leaned in to examine the repair more closely, his experienced eyes checking the quality of her craftsmanship. Sarah felt confident in her work, but still experienced the natural nervousness that came with having such a senior officer scrutinize her efforts. Morrison pointed to several components, asking about torque specifications and replacement intervals. As Sarah reached across the engine to point out a particular component, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing the tattoo on her inner wrist. It was only visible for a moment, just long enough for Morrison to notice the elegant script before her sleeve fell back into place. The general's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something crossing his face that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Morrison straightened up and continued his questioning, but Sarah noticed that his demeanor had shifted. He seemed more thoughtful, perhaps even emotional, though he maintained his professional composure. The inspection continued for another 10 minutes, with the general asking about parts procurement, training procedures, and safety protocols. Before moving to the next work area, Morrison paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Specialist Martinez, you've done excellent work here. This repair meets the highest standards I've seen." He hesitated for just a moment before adding, "Your attention to detail and dedication to your fellow soldiers is exactly what this army needs." As the general's party moved on to inspect other areas of the motor pool, Sarah wondered about that brief moment when his expression had changed. Had he really seen her tattoo, or was she imagining things? And if he had seen it, why had it seemed to affect him so deeply? Sergeant Davis approached her once the inspection party had moved to another part of the base. "That was impressive, Martinez. The general doesn't usually spend that much time with individual soldiers. You made a good impression." Sarah nodded, but her mind was still processing the encounter. There had been something almost personal in the way Morrison had looked at her, especially after that moment when her sleeve had shifted. She tried to dismiss the thought, focusing instead on the satisfaction of having her work recognized by such a senior officer. The rest of the day passed normally, with Sarah completing the Humvee testing and beginning work on another vehicle. But she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the inspection and the general's reaction. That evening, as she lay in her bunk, she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter had been more significant than it appeared. What Sarah didn't know was that General Morrison had spent the remainder of his visit thinking about that simple tattoo, and the memories it had suddenly brought flooding back. In his quarters that night, he stared at a faded photograph he always carried with him, trying to decide whether he had the courage to seek out Specialist Martinez again and ask her about those words written in elegant script on her wrist. The general had recognized the handwriting immediately. Even in that brief glimpse, it was impossible, he told himself. It had to be a coincidence. But deep in his heart, he knew better. Some things couldn't be explained by chance alone, and sometimes the universe had ways of bringing people together across impossible distances and unlikely circumstances. Morrison made a decision that night that would change both his life and Sarah's forever. General Morrison barely slept that night. He kept pulling out the worn photograph from his wallet, studying the face of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The image was faded around the edges, creased from years of being carried in uniform pockets across 3 different deployments. Maria Elena Vasquez had been 22 when the photo was taken, just a year older than Specialist Martinez was now. The handwriting in that brief glimpse of the tattoo had been unmistakable. Morrison had stared at Maria's letters for hours during his first deployment to Iraq 15 years ago. She had written to him faithfully, her elegant cursive filling pages with news from home, encouragement during difficult times, and dreams about their future together. He had memorized every curve of her handwriting, every flourish of her pen. Maria had been a teacher at an elementary school in El Paso, passionate about helping children from immigrant families succeed in their new country. She spoke Spanish and English with equal fluency, often serving as a translator for parents who struggled to communicate with school administrators. Morrison had met her at a community event honoring local veterans, and they had fallen in love over long conversations about service, family, and the responsibility to help others. Their relationship had grown stronger during his deployment, sustained by letters, occasional phone calls, and an unshakable faith in their connection. Maria had supported his military career even when it meant long separations and uncertain futures. She understood duty and sacrifice in ways that made their bond even deeper. Morrison remembered the last letter he had received from her, written just days before the accident. She had been excited about a promotion at school and had mentioned wanting to get a tattoo to celebrate his upcoming return home. Para mi soldado valiente, she had written, for my brave soldier. But she had changed her mind, deciding instead on something that honored her own heritage and strength. Para mi hija valiente, she had written in her next letter. For my brave daughter, because my mother used to call me that, and I want to carry her words with me always. That letter had arrived 3 days after Maria died in a car accident. A drunk driver had run a red light, ending the life of the woman Morrison had planned to marry. He had been granted emergency leave to attend her funeral, but the grief had been overwhelming. Maria's mother, devastated by her own loss, had embraced Morrison at the service and whispered, "She loved you so much, mijo. She would have wanted you to find happiness again." But Morrison had never remarried. He had thrown himself into his military career, rising through the ranks while carefully avoiding any romantic relationships that might lead to the kind of devastating loss he had experienced with Maria. He had convinced himself that some people were meant to love only once, and he had been fortunate enough to experience that kind of love, even if it had been cut tragically short. Now, 15 years later, he found himself wondering if the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on him. What were the odds that he would encounter a young woman with Maria's exact handwriting tattooed on her wrist? What were the chances that this soldier would be serving under his command, thousands of miles from where Maria had lived and died? Morrison spent the early morning hours walking the perimeter of the base, trying to clear his head and process the emotions that had been stirred up by yesterday's encounter. The desert dawn was beautiful in its starkness, with the sun rising over distant mountains and painting the landscape in shades of gold and copper. He had always found solace in these quiet moments before the base came fully alive with the day's activities. As he walked, Morrison thought about Specialist Martinez and the brief conversation they had shared. She had impressed him not just with her technical skills, but with her confidence and professionalism. There had been something familiar about her presence, a warmth and competence that reminded him of Maria, in ways that went beyond the handwriting. He made a decision as he completed his circuit of the base perimeter. He would find a way to speak with Specialist Martinez privately, not as a general conducting an inspection, but as a person seeking to understand an impossible coincidence. He owed it to Maria's memory and to his own peace of mind to learn more about this young woman and the story behind her tattoo. Morrison knew he would have to be careful. Military protocol was clear about relationships between officers and enlisted personnel. and he had no intention of crossing any inappropriate lines. But he also knew that some encounters in life were too significant to ignore, and this felt like one of those moments when the past and present collided in ways that demanded attention. The general made his way to the communications center to check on routine reports from other units in the region. As he reviewed intelligence briefings and operational updates, part of his mind remained focused on the conversation he would need to have with Specialist Martinez. How did one ask about something so personal while maintaining military professionalism? How did one explain the significance of a glimpse of handwriting without sounding either crazy or inappropriate? Morrison had faced enemy fire, made life and death decisions under extreme pressure, and commanded thousands of soldiers in complex operations. But the prospect of asking a young specialist about her tattoo felt more daunting than any military challenge he had ever encountered. Some battles were fought with weapons and strategy. Others required only the courage to ask a simple question that might change everything. By mid-morning, he had decided on his approach. He would visit the motor pool again, ostensibly to follow up on yesterday's inspection, and find a natural way to speak with Martinez privately. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. What Morrison didn't know was that Sarah had spent her own sleepless night thinking about their encounter, wondering why the general had seemed so affected by their conversation and whether she had somehow said or done something wrong during the inspection. Sarah was adjusting the carburetor on a transport truck when she noticed the approaching figure. General Morrison walked alone this time, without his usual entourage of aides and base commanders. Something about his solitary presence made her stomach flutter with nervousness. Senior officers didn't typically return for casual follow-up visits, especially not without their staff. She wiped her hands quickly and stood at attention as Morrison approached her work area. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting against desert sun and the weight of command decisions. There was something different about his demeanor today, less formal and more personal, though he maintained the bearing of a career military officer. At ease, Specialist Martinez, Morrison said, his voice gentler than she remembered from yesterday's inspection. I wanted to follow up on that Humvee repair and discuss your work here. Sarah relaxed slightly but remained alert. Yes, sir. The vehicle passed all diagnostic tests this morning. It's ready for mission deployment whenever needed. Morrison nodded approvingly. Excellent work. Your reputation for thoroughness is well deserved. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I'd like to speak with you privately, if you have a few minutes. Perhaps we could walk to the office area where we can talk without interruption. The request was unusual but not inappropriate. Sarah followed the general to a small administrative building adjacent to the motor pool. The office he chose was simple and functional, with military-issued furniture and maps of the region covering one wall. Morrison gestured for her to take a seat while he remained standing, clearly struggling with how to begin the conversation. Specialist Martinez, what I'm about to ask may seem unusual, but I hope you'll understand that it comes from a place of genuine curiosity, not any attempt to invade your privacy. Morrison took a deep breath. Yesterday, I happened to notice what appeared to be a tattoo on your wrist. I'm wondering if you would be comfortable sharing what it says. Sarah was surprised by the question but didn't sense any inappropriate intent. She had been asked about her tattoo before by curious fellow soldiers, and she was generally comfortable discussing its meaning with people she trusted. Something about Morrison's tone suggested this was more than casual curiosity. She rolled up her sleeve to reveal the delicate script. It says para mi hija valiente, sir. It means for my brave daughter in Spanish. It's something my father used to say to me, and my grandmother said to my mother before that. It's been a family phrase for generations. Morrison's face went pale. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his breast pocket. Sarah watched with growing concern as the general's composure, so steady during yesterday's inspection, seemed to crack before her eyes. Sir, are you all right? She asked, instinctively leaning forward with concern. Morrison pulled out a small, worn photograph and placed it on the desk between them. Sarah looked down to see a beautiful young woman with dark hair and a warm smile, standing in front of what appeared to be an elementary school. There was something familiar about the woman's face, though Sarah was certain she had never seen the photograph before. This was Maria Elena Vasquez, Morrison said quietly. I was going to marry her 15 years ago before she died in a car accident while I was deployed to Iraq. His voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully managed but never fully healed. Sarah studied the photograph more carefully, trying to understand why the general was sharing something so personal. The woman was beautiful, with an open, intelligent expression that suggested kindness and strength. But Sarah still didn't understand the connection to her own tattoo. Morrison reached into his pocket again and withdrew a small silver pendant on a thin chain. He placed it next to the photograph, and Sarah could see words engraved on its surface in the same elegant script as her tattoo. The pendant read, Para mi hija valiente. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Sir, I don't understand. How do you have those words? This is a family phrase that my grandmother passed down to my mother and then to me. Maria's last letter to me mentioned that she wanted to get a tattoo, Morrison explained, his voice barely above a whisper. She had decided on those exact words, Para mi hija valiente, because her mother used to call her that. She wanted to honor her heritage and carry her mother's love with her always. The office fell silent as Sarah processed this information. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of her. She picked up the pendant with shaking hands, recognizing the handwriting that was nearly identical to her own grandmother's careful script. What was her last name before Vasquez? Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Sandoval, Morrison replied. Maria Elena Sandoval before she married briefly in her early 20s. She kept her ex-husband's name even after the divorce, but her family name was Sandoval. Sarah felt the world shift around her. Sandoval was her grandmother's maiden name. Her grandmother, Elena Sandoval, had emigrated from Mexico as a young woman and had always spoken of the sister she had left behind, the sister she had lost touch with over the decades as life and distance made communication difficult. My grandmother was Elena Sandoval, Sarah whispered. She had a younger sister named Maria, who she lost contact with years ago. Abuela always regretted not trying harder to find her. Morrison leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what they were discovering. Maria mentioned an older sister named Elena, who had moved to the United States years before. She always wondered what had happened to her family in Arizona. The two soldiers sat in stunned silence, processing the realization that they were connected by family ties neither had known existed. Sarah was holding the pendant that had belonged to her great-aunt, a woman she had never met, but whose words had been passed down through generations of strong women in her family. Maria would have been your grandmother's younger sister, Morrison said slowly. That would make her your great-aunt. She died before you were born, but she carried the same words that your grandmother passed down to you. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she thought about the generations of women who had shared this phrase, this blessing that connected them across time and distance. Her grandmother had often spoken sadly about the sister she had left behind in Mexico, the family connections that had been severed by immigration, and the challenges of staying in touch across borders and decades. She would have loved to know about you, Morrison continued. Maria always talked about family, about the importance of staying connected to our roots and honoring those who came before us. She would have been so proud to know that her sister's granddaughter grew up to serve her country with such dedication. Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to maintain her composure in front of the general. But the emotional weight of the discovery was overwhelming. She had grown up hearing stories about Tia Maria, the sister her grandmother had never stopped missing. Now she was learning that this beloved but unknown relative had been planning to carry the same family words on her skin, just as Sarah had chosen to do decades later. Morrison carefully returned the photograph and pendant to his pocket. I hope you understand why I had to ask about your tattoo. Seeing those words in Maria's handwriting was like seeing a ghost from my past. I understand completely, sir, Sarah replied. And I'm grateful you told me about her. My grandmother always wondered what happened to her sister. At least now I know that she was loved and that her memory has been honored all these years. The general stood to leave, but paused at the door. Specialist Martinez, I hope we can speak again before my visit ends. There's more I'd like to share about Maria, if you're interested in learning about your great-aunt. Sarah nodded eagerly. I would be honored, sir. And General, I think my grandmother would want you to know that Maria's family never forgot her, either. Love like that doesn't die, even when people do. 3 weeks had passed since the extraordinary revelation in the motor pool office. Sarah had spent countless hours reading through Maria's journal, discovering the thoughts and dreams of the great-aunt she had never known. Each entry revealed more about the remarkable woman who had shared not just family blood, but also similar values of service, education, and determination. The journal entries from Maria's final months painted a picture of someone deeply in love, but also committed to her own growth and independence. She had written about her plans to expand literacy programs at her school, her excitement about Morrison's eventual return from deployment, and her ongoing sadness about the family connections that distance had severed. Sarah had called her mother immediately after learning about Maria, and their conversation had lasted for hours. Her mother, Carmen, had been stunned to learn about the sister her own mother had mourned for decades. Carmen remembered her grandmother, Elena, speaking wistfully about Maria, especially during holidays when the absence of extended family felt most acute. Your abuela never stopped hoping she would find her sister again, Carmen had told Sarah through tears. She used to say that someday, somehow, the family would be reunited. I think she would see this as an answer to her prayers, even if it came in a way none of us could have imagined. The discovery had created an unexpected bond between Sarah and General Morrison. While they maintained appropriate military protocol during official interactions, Morrison had begun stopping by the motor pool periodically to share more stories about Maria and to learn about Sarah's own family history. During one of these conversations, Morrison had revealed something that surprised Sarah even more than their initial discovery. He had been in contact with Maria's elderly mother, who still lived in El Paso for all the years since Maria's death. He had made it his personal mission to ensure that she was cared for, visiting her whenever his duties brought him to Texas, and helping with medical expenses and home maintenance. I promised Maria I would take care of her mother, Morrison had explained. It was one of the last things we talked about before she died. Mrs. Sandoval is 91 now, but she's still sharp and independent. She would love to know about you. The idea of meeting her great-grandmother, Elena's mother and Maria's mother, filled Sarah with excitement and nervousness. This woman was the matriarch who had originally blessed her daughters with the words that now adorned Sarah's wrist. She was the living link to a family history that had seemed lost forever. Morrison had arranged for a secure video call between Sarah and Mrs. Sandoval using the base's communication facilities. When the elderly woman's face appeared on the screen, Sarah immediately saw the family resemblance. Mrs. Sandoval had the same determined chin and expressive eyes that Sarah recognized from looking in mirrors and family photographs. The conversation had been emotional and healing for both women. Mrs. Sandoval wept when she saw Sarah's tattoo and heard about Elena's life in Arizona. She shared stories about both her daughters, about the pain of separation that had haunted her for decades, and about her joy in finally knowing that Elena's family had thrived in America. Mija, you look so much like your grandmother when she was young, Mrs. Sandoval had said. Elena would be so proud to see what you've become. A soldier, a mechanic, a brave woman serving her country. This is exactly what she would have wanted for her granddaughter. The elderly woman had also shared more stories about Maria, filling in details that even Morrison hadn't known. Maria had volunteered at a local veterans center, helping former soldiers adjust to civilian life. She had learned English as a second language and had been working on her citizenship when she died. Most importantly, she had never stopped talking about her sister Elena and expressing hope that they would reunite someday. Maria used to say that love finds a way, Mrs. Sandoval had told them both. She believed that the important connections in life couldn't be broken by distance or time. I think she would see your meeting as proof that she was right. After the video call, Morrison and Sarah had walked together around the base perimeter, both processing the emotional weight of these family revelations. Morrison shared more details about his relationship with Maria, describing their plans for marriage and the future they had envisioned together. Sarah told him about her grandmother Elena's stories, about growing up with the constant awareness that part of their family history remained unknown and unreachable. "I've been thinking about something," Morrison said as they paused near the motor pool. "After your deployment ends, would you be interested in visiting Mrs. Sandoval in El Paso? I think it would mean the world to her to meet you in person." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I would love that, sir. It feels like something I need to do, not just for her, but for my grandmother's memory, and for Maria's memory too." Morrison nodded approvingly. "I'll arrange everything. Mrs. Sandoval has been like a second mother to me since Maria died. Introducing her to Elena's granddaughter feels like completing a circle that was broken too long ago." Over the following days, Sarah found herself thinking differently about her deployment and her military service. The work remained the same: repairing vehicles, maintaining equipment, ensuring that her fellow soldiers had reliable transportation for their missions. But now she felt connected to a larger story, a family legacy of strength and service that spanned generations and continents. She began writing more detailed letters home, sharing not just her daily experiences, but also the stories Morrison had told her about Maria. Sarah's mother had started researching the family history more thoroughly, reaching out to distant relatives and piecing together the immigration story that had separated the sisters decades earlier. Morrison had also begun including Sarah in some of the higher-level briefings about motor pool operations, recognizing her expertise and her potential for leadership. He mentioned the possibility of recommending her for advanced technical training or even officer candidate school when her current enlistment ended. "You have the same qualities that made Maria special," he told her during one of their conversations: "intelligence, compassion, and a natural ability to inspire confidence in others. The Army needs leaders like you." Sarah was honored by the recognition, but also thoughtful about her future plans. Meeting Morrison and learning about Maria had given her a new perspective on the importance of family connections and the ways that service could take many different forms. She was beginning to consider how she might use her military experience to serve her community after her enlistment ended, perhaps following in Maria's footsteps by working in education or veteran services. The bond between Sarah and Morrison had evolved into something resembling the relationship between a mentor and protege. Though both were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, Morrison saw in Sarah not just Maria's family resemblance but also her dedication to excellence and her genuine care for others. Sarah saw in Morrison a connection to family history she had never known, and an example of how love and loss could motivate a lifetime of service to others. As Sarah's deployment entered its final months, she knew that her life had been fundamentally changed by this encounter. The tattoo on her wrist now carried even deeper meaning, connecting her not just to her immediate family but to a great-aunt, whose love story had somehow intersected with her own military journey. The desert sun continued to beat down on the motor pool each day, but now Sarah worked with the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself, part of a family story that had been incomplete for too long and was finally being made whole again. 6 months after her extraordinary encounter with General Morrison, Sarah stood in the living room of a modest house in El Paso, Texas, holding the hands of a 91-year-old woman whose eyes sparkled with tears of joy. Mrs. Isabel Sandoval was smaller and more fragile than she had appeared on the video screen, but her grip was surprisingly strong as she pulled Sarah into an embrace that felt like coming home. "Ay, mija, you look so much like my Elena when she was your age," Mrs. Sandoval whispered in accented English, switching seamlessly between languages as many bilingual families do. "I have been waiting for this day for so many years, praying that somehow I would meet Elena's family again before I died." Sarah's deployment had ended 2 weeks earlier, and she had used her leave time to make this pilgrimage to El Paso. Morrison had indeed arranged everything, ensuring that Sarah had transportation and accommodation, but more importantly, he had prepared Mrs. Sandoval for this reunion with months of phone calls and visits. The house was filled with photographs spanning nearly a century of family history. Mrs. Sandoval led Sarah from room to room, explaining each picture and telling stories about relatives Sarah had never known existed. There were wedding photos, graduation pictures, and family gatherings that documented a rich history of love, struggle, and achievement. In Maria's old bedroom, which Mrs. Sandoval had preserved exactly as it was the day her daughter died, Sarah found more connections to her own family. Maria's bookshelf contained the same titles in Spanish that Sarah's grandmother had treasured. Her jewelry box held simple pieces that matched descriptions of jewelry Elena had brought from Mexico decades earlier. Most remarkably, Sarah discovered a letter that Maria had been writing to Elena just days before her death. The letter was unfinished, still in the typewriter that sat on Maria's old desk, but it expressed everything that Sarah's grandmother had hoped to hear during all those years of wondering about her lost sister. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, "not a day passes that I don't think about you and wonder about the life you've built in Arizona. I dream about your children and whether they look like you or carry themselves with the same strength that I remember from our childhood. I hope they know how brave their mother was to leave everything familiar and build a new life in a foreign place." Sarah read the unfinished letter aloud to Mrs. Sandoval, both women crying as they heard Maria's words expressing the same longing for connection that Elena had carried for so many years. The letter went on to describe Maria's work as a teacher, her love for Morrison, and her plans to somehow find Elena's family after Morrison returned from deployment. Morrison arrived at the house that evening carrying fresh flowers for Maria's grave and a bag of groceries for Mrs. Sandoval. The three of them prepared dinner together, sharing stories and creating new memories that honored both Elena and Maria's legacy. Morrison showed Sarah photographs from his relationship with Maria, including pictures from the Christmas party where they had met and the formal military ball where he had planned to propose. After dinner, they visited the cemetery where Maria was buried. Sarah placed a small bouquet of desert wildflowers on the grave, flowers she had pressed and preserved from Afghanistan. She knelt beside the headstone and spoke quietly to the great aunt she had never met, telling her about Elena's life, about the family that had never forgotten her, and about the love story that had somehow connected them all across time and distance. Morrison stood quietly nearby, observing this first meeting between Maria's family and her final resting place. He had visited this grave hundreds of times over the years, but having Sarah there transformed the experience from one of solitary grief to one of shared remembrance and celebration. Over the next few days, Sarah learned more about her extended family history than she had ever imagined possible. Mrs. Sandoval had maintained contact with other relatives in Mexico, and she arranged for Sarah to speak with cousins and aunts she had never known existed. The family tree that had seemed so sparse suddenly revealed itself to be rich with connections spanning several states and 2 countries. On Sarah's final day in El Paso, Morrison took her to the elementary school where Maria had taught. The current principal, who had worked with Maria for several years, showed them the memorial garden that had been created in her honor. Students had planted flowers and maintained a small reading area where Maria's favorite educational quotes were displayed, on weathered plaques. "She touched so many lives," the principal explained. "Even now, 15 years later, we have former students who come back to visit and talk about how much Miss Vasquez believed in them. She had this gift for seeing potential in children who had been overlooked by others." Sarah stood in the garden, surrounded by the continuing legacy of a woman she had never met, but whose influence had somehow shaped her own life. The scholarship fund Morrison had established in Maria's name had helped dozens of students pursue higher education, continuing her work of empowering young people from immigrant families. As Sarah prepared to return to Arizona and begin the process of transitioning from military to civilian life, she carried with her not just Maria's journal and the pendant Morrison had given her, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Her encounter with Morrison and the discovery of her connection to Maria had clarified her own calling in ways she hadn't expected. She had decided to use her GI benefits to pursue a degree in education, with plans to work with children from military families who faced the unique challenges of frequent moves, deployments, and the stress of having parents in dangerous occupations. She wanted to create programs that would help these children feel stable and supported, regardless of where their military families were stationed. Morrison had written a letter of recommendation, supporting her application to several universities, praising not just her technical skills and military service, but also her character and her commitment to helping others. He had become more than just the general who had noticed her tattoo. He had become a mentor and a connection to family history that enriched her understanding of herself and her purpose. On her final evening in El Paso, Sarah sat with Mrs. Sandoval on the front porch, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The elderly woman held Sarah's hand, her fingers tracing the tattoo that had started this incredible journey. "You know, mija, I think Elena and Maria are together now, watching us and smiling," Mrs. Sandoval said softly. "They were always so sad about being separated, but look what their love created, you and the general, brought together by their memory, continuing their story in ways they never could have imagined." Sarah squeezed her great-grandmother's hand, feeling the truth of those words in her heart. The tattoo on her wrist would always remind her of her father's love and her grandmother's strength, but now it also connected her to Maria's dreams and Morrison's devotion. Love, she had learned, really did find a way to continue, even across the barriers of time, distance, and loss. As Sarah boarded her flight back to Arizona the next morning, she carried with her not just Maria's journal and the silver pendant, but also the knowledge that sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most unexpected places. A simple tattoo noticed during a routine inspection in the Afghan desert had unlocked a family history that had been lost for decades and created a connection that would last a lifetime. The story that had begun with a young woman repairing a damaged Humvee had become something much larger, a testament to the enduring power of love, the importance of family connections, and the mysterious ways that life sometimes brings the right people together at exactly the right moment. Sarah's journey was far from over, but now she traveled with the blessing of generations of strong women and the support of a general who had become family in the most unexpected way possible.